everybody, if I haven't already, to set up some check-in meetings for the how you're doing on the MAQ project, where you're at, what help you might need, where your struggles are, etc. It's informal, check-in meeting. So be on the lookout for that. The MAQ management plan template is in pretty good shape, so I expect to share that. I hope at the next month's meeting for people to look at. Uh, and other upcoming uh, training that we're going to do on this topic. We're going to have the plan is to do something on fire resistant rated construction, just a very broad general overview, probably this spring, another webinar on exemptions to hazardous materials. We might have a separate one for medical gases that kind of fall into, can be part of the exemptions for I2 occupancies. So those are some things that we'll have coming this spring. And as always, reach out with any questions or concerns anytime. So I'm going to stop sharing this. And what I wanted to do next is go ahead and share. Let's see. A month or two ago, I shared a table that compares the differences in occupancies and how the MAQs are impacted. So what I wanted to do is kind of walk through what that means on a really broad level so that everybody's on the same page. So there are different types of occupancies in the California Building Code, and some of those different occupancies there are impacts on how you apply MAQ limits. And everyone can see my screen, right? The PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay, great. So we're going to just walk through some of that, what those differences are, and do a really broad overview of the occupancy types, because we have all these occupancies across all of our locations. And there'll definitely be time for questions. Okay, so why do we have different types of occupancies? The intended use of the space is really what drives the occupancy classification. So, for example, if you have an assembly occupancy, you may need a minimum number of exits, with exit signage and panic hardware on the doors. So there are particular construction and fire safety requirements that are impacted by the occupancy type, or the occupancy type provides those requirements. And some of these occupancy types have changed over the years. So if you've been looking at the code for more than 20 years, some of the things that you see and your record drawings will show an occupancy type that may not be the same as what is currently in the code today. So keep that in mind when you're looking at if you look at an old H4 occupancy, for example, it may not be the same type of occupancy as in the modern code. So there are some differences, and we won't really go over that, but we're going to do a really broad overview of all the different types of occupancies. So these are all the occupancy types that we have in the California Building Code. And I'm not going to mention, we'll just go over each one because we have all of these across our locations. And some of them have big impacts on how you apply MAQs. So it's helpful for everybody to just understand that. What I'm not going to talk about are incidental use areas. You can find out more in the building code in section 509, but these are certain parts of they don't need to be separate occupancies if they're kind of an accessory and meet certain conditions, accessory to the primary occupancy. I also am not going to talk about outdoor control areas today. But those have particular requirements in Chapter 50 of the Fire Code. So I just want to point out that these two occupancies, Group C and Group L, are only in California. And this is important because for the Group L, it's important because you may get designers, architects from national firms that are coming in and designing your lab buildings, and they're applying, the International Fire Code Chapter 38, which is on higher education laboratories. California does not adopt Chapter 38. We have our own Group L laboratory occupancy, which is different from that Chapter 38. So tell them they need to follow the California Building Code, and that has the Group L laboratory occupancies. And so it's happened before. Just keep that in mind. Don't let them apply Chapter 38. They need to use Group L if they're intending to design for laboratory spaces or Group L. Okay, so what are these different occupancies? Assemblies, we certainly have these. You have them certainly on your location, whether it's a cafeteria, lecture hall, or, a stadium. And in general, the standard MAQs are going to apply to every type of occupancy, and with some exceptions. We'll talk more about the exceptions. The general MAQs do apply. However, certain occupancies do have materials specific restrictions that are more strict than the MAQs. For example, toxic gases. You can't store toxic gases in a movie theater. It's not appropriate. It is
My
not
name's going to be in here now in your thing. Sorry.
So keep in mind that although the general MAQ tables apply, some occupancies have additional restrictions for certain hazard categories. Okay. Group B, now these are going to be the most common occupancy types we have on our campuses or health centers in general. Maybe not the health centers as much, but these are everything from your professional services, dentist's office, banks. Okay, so a lot of our laboratories are designed to Group B occupancy, sometimes called B labs. These are really common and probably what you have in a lot of your buildings. Okay, and this is where our standard MAQs are going to apply. Group C, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but camps for outdoor group living. We're not going to have a lot of hazmat in these, so kind of just gloss over it. But just so you know, organized camps, Group C. Group B, educational. This is generally your K through 12 education, but also childcare facilities. And you probably have some of these childcare facilities at your location. So they are around Group B occupancies. And again, this is not one where you'd see a lot of hazardous materials, and there are some material-specific restrictions for sure in Group B spaces. The only place you might see them would be like a high school chemistry teaching lab or something like that, which we don't really have at our university locations. Okay, Group F. Some people think, oh, we don't have any of these factory spaces at our locations, but this could just be a single room. But we certainly do. I know a chemistry department often has their own wood shop or metal shop, or engineering will have them fabrication spaces, 3D printer space. These are certainly present, and sometimes it's just a single room being used for these purposes. And they can have additional high hazards, hazardous materials. They may also have combustible metals. Okay. Group H. Now, this is definitely our high hazard occupancy type. So this could be a whole building or a single room. These H's have changed over the years. So currently our H1, 2s, and 3s are for physical hazards. H1s are, H1 occupancies are for detonation hazards, and H2s for deflagration hazards. Both detonation and deflagration hazards are explosives, but detonation is something that explodes faster than the speed of sound. So your supersonic explosives And the lesser of the physical hazards would be your H3 occupancies, things like flammables or lower level oxidizers. So the hazard goes up in these occupancies types. H4 occupancies are designed to have unlimited health hazard materials, corrosives, toxics, highly toxics. And H5s are very specialized. They are semiconductor fabrication facilities. So we do have a handful of these across the UCs. And I'm going to go into more detail on all of these occupancies later. Group I are institutional occupancies. We certainly have hospitals at our health centers. And these generally follow the Group B requirements with some exceptions. All right, and Group L, this is, like I said, unique to California. This was formerly called the Group H8 occupancy. So if you have a building that was constructed prior to 2007 and designed as a Group H8, it's somewhat equivalent to the modern Group L occupancy. And this is the most favorable type of building for laboratories higher than 3 stories, with the exception of Group H, like the H2s or H3s, H4s. So in general, this is very supportive, of higher level buildings, high-rise buildings that have laboratories. And we'll go into why as we move along.
Megan and Steve.
Yeah.
Just real quickly, it's super important to understand that this is a design choice and not a code requirement.
That is correct. Just because you have a laboratory space, it's not automatically a Group L occupancy. It has to be designed with all the building code requirements to meet the Group L occupancy type. Is that kind of what you were saying, Steve?
Correct. The code requirement based on use in hazardous material storage commodities and quantities would be either a B or an H, one of the H categories. And L is a designer's choice. So it's a user gets to determine if they choose to build an L, which there's cost implications greater than that of a B lab.
Right. Correct. Yeah, and we're going to walk through some specific examples of how these are different. This isn't really for anyone to memorize all of these. It's just to help provide some guidance when you do have designers come to you to provide them, some of the options of what might or might not be suitable for a building. As it's a designer's choice. Okay, Group M, mercantile. These are like grocery stores, drugstores, Home Depot, gas stations. It could be greenhouses if they're open to the public and selling plants. Some people have wondered, what about a chemical stockroom? Could you call that a Group M? And personally, I would say, that is not what the Group M was intended for, because you have a lot of the high chemical usage would push you more towards, a group high hazard occupancy. What about a pharmacy? If you have a pharmacy that is has a counter that's open to the public and you're selling pharmaceuticals or other drugs, have hazmat there, that would be a Group M occupancy. But a compounding facility not open to the public would not really be appropriate as a Group M.
What's the difference between a drugstore and a pharmacy?
Well, the drugstore has all that other stuff as well. Often, like okay. CVS, the aisles that have cleaning products, and there's a pharmacy in the back, but they could be one and the same. But there's the part that's the pharmacy and the part that's the general, drugstore selling cleaning supplies and other things. And because, you may need to have a large, 20 pallets of bleach at your Home Depot, there are some reasons to allow them to have higher quantities. And so Group M's and S's, as we'll detail, can have very, very high quantities of chemicals. Okay, Group R, residential. I'm not going to talk about all of these differences, but we do certainly have dorms and some maybe of these other types of group residential occupancies. This is another one where certainly material specific restrictions can apply to your hazardous materials, to your MAQs. You don't really want these kids in dorms to be storing toxic gases. That's not really appropriate. And if they're doing that, it should cause some concern. You might want to look into that. So they're not allowed to have toxic gases, for example, in a group R space. Okay, group S storage. These can be, we certainly have parking garages, S2s. This could also be spaces that are high piled storage with all kinds of different materials being stored there. Berkeley had an S1 space where they were constructing a brand new pool, and they wanted an accessory building that just stored pool chemicals. And it was designed as an S1, and it had the appropriate sort of sprinkler coverage and spacing to store a fair number of, class 3 oxidizers and things that were supporting the pool maintenance. Okay, so these are certainly present, and you can often have a lot more higher MAQs in these spaces. Okay, group U, we definitely have these on many of our sites with agricultural buildings, sheds, stables, greenhouses, barns. Water tanks could be included. I wouldn't include fuel tanks in group U. I would personally call them outdoor control areas if they're outside. So just to run through the fact that we have pretty much every occupancy type across all of our UCs. And what does that mean in terms of MAQs? So I'm going to walk us through this table. I shared a version of this with the group at the last meeting, and I'll share it again. But essentially, if you look at a group B occupancy and any of the others not listed, they sort of meet certain criteria. And the ones that are different would include these group Ls, group Ms, S's, and H. But anything that's not a group B generally follows the same rules as, the A's and the I's and the R's would basically have the same MAQ limits as a group B, with the exception of those material specific restrictions, like toxic gases, for example. Okay, so what do we call the area where we have MAQs? It's called a control area for a group B, and everyone here is familiar with that term. But if you have a group L occupancy, it is not a control area. It is called a laboratory suite, or lab suite for short. Group M and S occupancies, it's a group M or mercantile for storage control area. They're different MAQs. And a group H is not a control area. It's either called a high hazard space, a group H occupancy, sometimes a flammable liquid storage room or a storage warehouse. It can have different names, but it is not a control area. And it usually references the group H occupancy or high hazard space. All right, so what about our MAQ table limits? So I'm going to walk through some examples, but the baseline MAQ table that everyone's familiar with, I'll show that in a minute, is what you apply to a control area or group B occupancy. Floor level reductions, there are standard floor level reductions. We'll walk through that as well. But group L has the same MAQ table that you have to follow, but there are more generous floor level reductions, and we'll show some side-by-side examples. Group M and S occupancies have special tables. They don't follow the same table limits unless the material that listed on this table is not, there are some things that are not listed on this table, and then you have to default to this for that hazard category. But the same floor level reductions do apply to M or S occupancies. And group H is the most complicated in a way because depending on the type of group H occupancy, some materials will be not restricted. There will be no limits. But I'm going to clarify that a lot of people think, group H, I just do any group H, everything's unlimited. And that is not true. And we're going to walk through that. Okay, but the floor level restrictions can still apply depending on some of the circumstances. Again, you would also have to build to the design your group H, following the standard, area limits, height limits, things like that in the building code. For example, like group H1s can only be on the first floor. You can't have them on the 10th floor. Okay, so let's walk through what this baseline table means. So this is the table that I think most people are familiar with, table 503111 from the fire code, with the maximum allowable quantity per control area of hazardous materials posing a physical hazard. There's another table right after this that's for health hazards. This is just an excerpt from the table, and the identical corresponding table on the building code is here, 30711.
Megan, did you intend to show us the table?
Yeah, can you not see that
No.
on the screen?
It's on the screen. I
Oh.
can see it.
I can
I
see
can
it.
see it.
Maybe I'm missing something. Oh, I
On
see.
the-
Megan, I see a screen.
Okay.
Okay, gotcha. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you for mentioning that. All right, so the way this works, let's just look at this example. Combustible liquid class 2, that would be like diesel fuel or acetic acid. If the group if you exceed the MAQs, you would be a group H2 or H3 occupancy. Okay, so you can be up to the control area limits, or else you get bumped to an H2 or H3 occupancy. So this tells you what type of H would be appropriate for this type of material. And so the storage limit for class 2 combustible liquids, if you go over here, is 120 gallons. And that's just the baseline amount, not accounting for sprinklers or storage. Okay, so that's what we have for our Group B occupancies. Now let's just look at the floor level reductions. So this table's from the fire code, same table on the building code for 1422, where it tells you that if you are in the first story above grade plane, you can have 100% of the MAQs on that table. And you can have up to 4 control areas on that first floor, and they have to be separated by fire barriers of not less than 1 hour fire resistance rating. Okay, so let's just look at the 4th floor, where you have you're only allowed 12.5% of the MAQs on that 4th floor, and you can only have 2 control areas on the 4th floor, and they have to be separated by 2-hour fire barriers. So as you go up, they are really going to be restricted on how many chemicals you can have in a building in a B occupancy.
Megan,
Yeah.
there's a question on the chat. It says, can group H be used within the group B? For example, if a building has 2 control areas in the first floor, can the first floor include 1 group H?
Well, that's a good question. And I have always interpreted the code to allow that, and strictly speaking, it does. But we did hear an interesting ICC interpretation suggesting that that may not be true. So I don't have a definitive answer, and I'm sort of like circling it through some other hazmat experts throughout the country to see what they think. And so far, most people in the hazmat community feel that that would be okay, with some restrictions. So be happy to talk more about that one, more at the end as well.
Thank you.
That was not a very definitive answer, sorry. Because I feel like there's right now a little bit of confusion on how to interpret that part of the code. Okay, moving on. So this is our B occupancy control area, how much you can have on every floor. Let's compare that to a laboratory suite. This is from table 453.721 from the building code. It's not in the fire code. If you have you're on the first story above grade plane, you can have 100% of your MAQs. And most new lab buildings are type 1 construction. So the type of construction does matter for these. You can have unlimited number of lab suites. The control area, you're limited to 4. Now you can have as many as you want, and they all get 100% MAQs. So no difference in the percent from a B to an L on the first floor. But let's jump to the 4th floor here. And now you can have 75% of your MAQs, which is a big jump from their 12.5%. And if it's type 1 construction, you can have up to 20 lab suites on that fourth floor, sorry. Okay, so the advantage for an L lab suites really come from those upper floors. If you're designing spaces for, or your designer wants to put a bunch of labs on upper floors. Okay, so just a side-by-side example, B in yellow here, L in pink. Let's just look at one example. Flammable liquids class 1, aggregate, that would be like isopropanol, ethanol, methanol. On the first floor, group B, you get 120 gallons, group L, 120 gallons. This is without any sprinklers or cabinet credits. Same, right? But on the fourth floor, you get 15 gallons in your control area versus 90 gallons per lab suite. And you can have a lot, 20 of these on the fourth floor, and you can only have 2 in a control area. That's even more extreme, let's say on the 9th floor, where you can only have 6 gallons of flammable liquids, class 1 flammable liquids in a control area, but you can have 10 times that amount in a lab suite. So if you had, let's say, like 4 or 5 PIs on this 9th floor control area, they have to share 6 gallons of flammable liquids in their control area. That will be extremely limiting for, research operations. Same thing. This is a similar example of just highly toxic solids on the first floor, 10 pounds in either B or L lab suite or control area, reduced in the fourth floor to a really small amount, just over 1 pound of highly toxic solids in a control area, where you get 7.5 pounds in a lab suite, and very, very limiting on the 9th floor for something, an example which has very low MAQs in general, but it's not too restrictive if you have an L suite. So that's just a comparison to understand B versus L and how one is better in certain situations. Okay, so let's let's move to the M's and S's. So this is a different table. This is the MAQ table for indoor and outdoor control areas in group M and S occupancies. And it's not for every category is not listed here. And you don't really need to pay attention to all these numbers and limits, but I'm going to show you a side by side. But in general, these limits are much, much higher than for our regular B control areas. But some materials like class 4 oxidizers are not allowed at all in any amounts. Even if you had a sprinkler building, they are not allowed. Okay, so some things are limited, some things you get more of. Similarly for flammable and combustible liquids in M and S occupancy, we've got class 1 liquids in this group with a much higher MAQ, even in a non-sprinkler building. But keep in mind, if you're going to be using this group M and S, and you may have a lot of the new like dorm buildings will have, the first floor will be retail space, maybe it'll be a little market. You could potentially have a lot. But there are a lot of limits to being able to use these tables. There are limits on container sizes. There are strict requirements on storage arrangement. For things like storing lots of flammable liquids sprinklered in the accordance with tables 5074363, those are usually like rack storage sprinkler designs for extra hazards. So you can't just call it an S and apply this amount without meeting all these other requirements. There's a lot of detailed requirements in the fire code in chapter 50, 503.11 that outline all these restrictions, container sizes, storage arrangements, pile heights, everything like that, if you want to use to apply this. Okay, so let's compare our B in yellow and M for a couple examples. The flammable liquids, class 1B, that's again like ethanol, let's say rubbing alcohol. You could have 120 gallons of in a control area, control area space, a non-sprinklered building. Non-sprinklered M or S, you could have 1,600 gallons of that stuff. So big difference. Class 4 oxidizers, as I mentioned, you can't have any in a B or an M unsprinklered building, but You can actually have a small quantity in a B occupancy if you have a sprinklered building. So that's what the star means. Look at our class 3 oxidizers. If you have a B occupancy, you can only have 10 pounds in a control area, but if it's an M or S occupancy, you can really have a lot more of that stuff. And these often are things like pool chemicals that have to be packaged. They're container size limits, you know, they have to be in the original manufacturer's packaging, etc. Corrosives, you can basically double MAQs and M&S occupancies. Toxics, you can also basically double. You can actually go quite a lot higher for certain and meet certain criteria. But you can't have toxic gases and an M or S occupancy if you are for areas that are open to the public. I mean, if you had an S that's not a warehouse, not open to the public, you can probably have some. These are in the material specific requirements. So a lot more for some materials, but there are other restrictions. So just keep that in mind, how these things are applied. All right. Any questions before we move on to high hazard?
There was one comment about, does the MAQ report reflect B or L MAQs, or all the MAQs for B? And I responded on the chat that it reflects whatever the occupancy is. It gives you the limit based upon the occupancy.
Well, I'll talk about that at the end, but you don't have to apply the correct limits. If you will have to assign the correct occupancy, and RSS Chemicals will do the right calculation. But you do have to assign the right floor level, the right occupancy, and it will do the rest. Okay, so you don't have to know this stuff, but it's just really you don't have to memorize these differences, but it's just more for general understanding and to guide design, provide more information on how best to design buildings. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the high hazard spaces, occupancies. So H1, again, these are detonation hazards. These are all the materials you could store in an H1 occupancy. And this is usually can only be a one-story building. It's usually like one of these bunkers that you might have seen that have to be able to withstand a potential detonation. So you can have detonable pyrophorics, explosives, unclassified detonable organic peroxides, class 4 oxidizers, unstable reactives, class 3 detonable, or class 4 unstable reactives in any amount. And any other lesser physical hazards could also be in these occupancies. This is just a portable magazine, another way you might store some of these. But this would be their H1. And apparently we do have at least one of these at one of our locations. It's a top secret. But if you could use it for, if you had extra, class 4 oxidizers, for example, you're having trouble storing. Okay. H2. Occupancies are deflagration hazards. So these would be flammable combustible liquids in open use. So like a dispensing room, or if you had an operation that used like dip tanks, it's like you have normally like flammable vapors in the air, or pressurized systems, combustible dust, flammable cryogenics, flammable gases, the higher level organic peroxides, class 3 oxidizers, pyrophorics, class 3 unstable reactives, or water reactives. Any of these could be in an H2 space. These buildings have limits on, you need to have exterior walls, and these are like blowout panels. You need usually some kind of explosion venting in an H2 occupancy because you have a deflagration hazard. Okay, so you could also have lower level physical hazards as well. So the H3s would be flammable combustible liquid storage. These are great for storage rooms, combustible fibers, oxidizing cryogenics or oxidizing gases, flammable solids, and the lower level, peroxides, unstable reactives. So these are things flammable and things that are oxidizers. These are great solutions for flammable liquid storage rooms or for Let's say you have a room supporting your hospital that has a lot of medical gases. You could have unlimited oxidizing gases in an H3 occupancy. H4 is for health hazards, corrosives, toxics, and highly toxics. These are things that are acutely toxic or corrosive that cause irreversible tissue damage. Things that are corrosive to metals are not regulated by the fire code, but you could still store them in here if you wanted to. And H5s are special. Here's Oski Bear. This is a space at UC Berkeley, Siddhartha Dye Hall. These are very, very specialized, and they use what are called hazardous protection materials. These are often hazardous materials that usually have end products that are not hazardous, like, you know, your silicon chips. You know, those things are not hazardous in themselves, but you're using silane gas to produce them, which is a pyrophoric gas. MAQs for H5s are calculated based on density. So in example, let's say you had class 1B flammable liquids like ethanol, you can have 0.025 gallons per square foot. So if you had a small room, you only can have 25 gallons. So that could be more restrictive than a control area. But if you had a bigger room, you could have 250 gallons of that. Baseline MAQ from a control area is 120 gallons. So that's all I'm going to say about the H5s. They're very specialized. I know we have a handful at just a few locations. And I'm going to spend more time talking about how the MAQs are calculated for group H occupancies. So this is a lot of information on this table, and the slides will be available. But basically, this is how I like to see this. So H1 occupancies can have explosives, unstable reactive class 4s, unclassified detonable organic peroxides, and class 4 oxidizers. No limits. If it's green, means no limits. No limits for any of these other physical hazards here in an H1. But your MAQs, you still have to follow the MAQs for your health hazards, corrosives, toxics, and highly toxics. You can't have unlimited corrosives in an H1 occupancy. You still have to follow the standard MAQ table. Similarly, H2 occupancies, for any of these materials, you still would have to be subject to the MAQ limits for H2, but you have no limits for flammable pyrophoric gases, oxidizing gases, flammable liquids in open use or in storage, pyrophorics, class 3 oxidizers or class 2 or lower, unstable reactives, 3 or 2, organic peroxides, water reactives, flammable solids, all unlimited for an H2, but you're still subject to the MAQ limits for these materials, your detonation hazards, and for your health hazards. H3s are a little bit more limited. You can't have unlimited flammable gases, for example. You can't have open use flammable liquids, but you can have, it's great for flammable liquid storage, it's great for oxidizing gases and your lower level physical hazards. But again, MAQ limits still apply in an H3 occupancy for health hazards. Your H4, the health hazards, you're limited to MAQs for all these things that are physical hazards, but you have unlimited, you can store unlimited health hazard materials, toxics, highly toxics, and corrosives. The only occupancy that is truly allows unlimited hazmat is an H1, H4 occupancy. That means the building is designed to meet the requirements of both H1 and H4. And that means if there's a difference in the requirements, the most restrictive requirements will apply. But that means you can have unlimited everything, right? H2, H4s are great. You know, if you have things that are like pyrophoric and toxic materials, because you can have unlimited flammable pyrophoric gases, all of your pyrophorics are unlimited, and you can have unlimited health hazards too, and all these other physical hazards. But you can't just have, you know, 50 pounds of class 4 oxidizers in an H2 occupancy. H3, H4s are also very useful for things like a chemical stockroom. If you're designing, you know, providing guidance on designing a new chemical stock room, an H3, H4 is very useful because you can store the most commonly used chemicals like flammable liquids, and your health hazard materials, which are really commonly used in labs. So those combo occupancies are in our 2022 fire code in RSS. So if you have a room that's designed for a combo, H occupancy, you can apply that, and the appropriate limits will apply. Okay, so that was a lot of information. What I think this came up already, and I just want to reiterate, chemicals will automatically apply the appropriate MAQs and floor reductions as long as you do what you need to by assigning rooms to the correct control area, assigning the correct occupancy type, and the floor level. It will apply the appropriate, if it's an M, it'll apply the right calculations. The default for all the buildings is a B occupancy. You don't necessarily need to change that if it's an R or an A, because the same MAQ limits would apply, but you can if you want. And you do need to be aware of those material specific restrictions that are more strict than the MAQ table. I also want to point out that there are some limits in RSS. RSS does not limit the number of control areas per floor. So remember I told you on the fourth floor, you can only have 2 control areas. RSS won't limit you. RSS would let you have 10. You need to be aware that you can only have 2. And it also doesn't include the material specific limitations for occupancy. We could program that in if there's interest in doing that, but that means you have to correctly assign every single building to the correct occupancy type. And like I said, this information is really to help guide you to providing appropriate guidance to when they ask your team, EH&S or our fire marshals, what would be the best building design? Here are the chemicals we want to have on these floors. You can sort of give them the options and say, we suggest you do this if you're going to be on the 10th floor. You can do whatever you want, but keep in mind you'll be restricted. So that's kind of all I had. And I will stop sharing so I can answer questions, so I can see everybody. And sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat, so.
We don't have any new questions in the chat from what we talked about. I'm sure people have questions. One of the things I want to bring up is that in the software, we call everything a control area, even though it's not. It's a lab suite or a storage area or a high hazard space. It's just that when we developed it, we didn't realize there were all those differences. So
that's right. So the terminology will always say control area, even if it's an L group. But if you assign it to a group L occupancy, it will apply the appropriate limits and restrictions for a group L lab suite, but it will call it a control area. So that is a limitation. But the correct, you'll get the right numbers if you plug that in. Any more questions?